The year was 1878, and the silence in Esther Prescott's world had a weight to it, a physical presence that settled in the hollows of her bones. It was the silence of the vast, unforgiving plains of West Texas, a land that stretched to every horizon, broken only by the shimmering heat and the occasional gnarled mesquite. But more than that, it was the silence of the house she shared with her father. It was a silence born of loss, nurtured by resentment, and now so deeply rooted it had become the foundation of their lives. Her father, Garrett Prescott, was a man carved from the same harsh material as the land he sought to tame. Grief had whittled him down to sharp edges and brittle resolve. Since her mother's death from fever 5 years prior, he had spoken to Esther mostly in commands, his voice as dry and rasping as dust skittering across the packed earth. He worked from before the sun bled over the eastern plains until long after it had sunk, a bruised and wounded purple, into the west. He fought the land, and in doing so seemed to fight the memory of the woman it had taken from him. Esther's days were a litany of chores, a rhythm of survival that left no room for hope. She mended, cooked, cleaned, and tended the small, struggling garden, her movements economical and practiced. She was 19, but felt ancient, her youth a currency spent on duty and unspoken sorrow. She remembered a time of laughter, of her mother's hands showing her how to braid her hair, of stories read by the fire. Now, the hearth was cold more often than not, and the only stories were the ones Esther relived in the privacy of her own mind, ghosts of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. She was a captive long before she was ever taken, shackled not by iron but by a love for a father who no longer knew how to receive it, and a duty to a home that felt more like a grave. The raid came on a Tuesday, under the unforgiving glare of the midday sun. It was a blur of dust, the thunder of unshod hooves, and a high, ululating cry that seemed to tear the fabric of the sky. Esther had been drawing water from the well when the sound reached her, a primal terror that froze her where she stood. Her father burst from the barn, his rifle already in his hands, his face a mask of grim fury she knew all too well. The world dissolved into chaos. The sharp crack of Garrett's rifle was answered by the whiz of arrows and the deeper boom of older firearms. Men on horseback, their bodies painted and lean, swarmed the small homestead. They were a force of nature, as swift and devastating as a flash flood. Esther saw her father stagger, a dark stain blossoming on his shoulder, and a scream was ripped from her throat. Before she could run to him, a rider broke from the whirlwind of motion, leaning low from his pony. A hard arm circled her waist, lifting her from the ground as if she were a sack of meal. Her world tilted, a dizzying panorama of churning dust, sky, and the strained sinew of the horse beneath her. She fought, kicking and clawing, but her struggles were useless against the iron grip that held her. She caught one last glimpse of her home, of her father on his knees, clutching his shoulder, his face contorted in a silent roar of anguish and rage. Then the homestead shrank behind them, swallowed by the plains, and Esther Prescott was swept away into the vast, terrifying wilderness. Her captor was a young Apache man, his face a study in fierce concentration. He rode with an innate grace that made him seem part of the animal, his body moving in perfect rhythm with the powerful stride of his horse. He did not speak to her, did not even look at her beyond ensuring his grip remained secure. For Esther, he was not a man. He was the embodiment of all her fears, the faceless savage from her father's bitter warnings. The journey was a torment of body and spirit. They rode for days, pushing deeper into a landscape that grew wilder and more alien with every mile. The sun beat down on her, and the constant jolting motion chafed her skin raw. At night, they made cold camps. He would bind her wrists loosely with a strip of leather, enough to prevent escape, but not enough to cause her pain, a strange and confusing mercy. He would offer her dried meat and a share of the water from his canteen. She refused at first, her defiance a small, pathetic ember in the face of his overwhelming power. But thirst and hunger were more potent than pride, and eventually she accepted what he gave, her eyes downcast, her heart a cold stone of dread in her chest. He never touched her beyond what was necessary. He was a silent, watchful presence, his stillness as unnerving as the violence of her capture. She studied him when she thought he wasn't looking, noting the way his black hair was held back by a simple band, the sharp line of his jaw, the deep, unreadable darkness of his eyes. There was no cruelty in them, but there was no pity either. There was only a profound and unsettling calm. They finally arrived at the rancheria, a scattered settlement of brush wickiups and hide lodges nestled in a hidden canyon, protected by soaring rock walls. The air buzzed with life, with the sounds of children playing, dogs barking, and the low murmur of voices speaking a language that grated on Esther's ears like stones grinding together. As she was led into the camp, a silence fell. Faces turned towards her, 100 pairs of eyes assessing her. She saw suspicion, hostility, and in the faces of the children, a raw curiosity. She was an alien creature, a symbol of the white encroachers who were stealing their land, their lives, their future. She pulled her tattered dress closer around her, her fear a physical cloak. She was given a space in a wickiup shared with an old woman whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles and whose eyes held a weary wisdom. Her captor, whose name she still did not know, spoke to the old woman in low, quiet tones, then turned and left without a word to Esther. For the first time since she was taken, she was alone, yet she had never felt more watched. The old woman, who the others called Istas, ignored her completely, going about her tasks as if Esther were a stray dog that had wandered into her home. The days that followed were a blur of isolation and observation. Her captor was her guard. He brought her food each morning, and even a simple portion of whatever the camp was eating. He would place the bowl near the entrance of the wickiup and retreat, settling himself a short distance away, his rifle across his knees. He was a sentinel, a shadow that marked the boundary of her world. Their interactions were wordless, a pantomime of necessity. He was the captor, she the captive. It was a simple, brutal truth that defined their existence. The silence between them was not the empty silence of her father's house. It was a living thing, filled with the static of mistrust, fear, and the vast, unbridgeable chasm of their two worlds. The sharp edges of Esther's terror slowly began to dull, worn down by the grinding monotony of her new reality. The initial paralyzing fear gave way to a weary resignation, and beneath that, a flicker of the same stubborn resilience that had kept her going in the suffocating quiet of her father's home. She could not simply wither and die. It was not in her nature. After a week of sitting in the dusty confines of the wickiup, a prisoner of her own fear, she began to move. She watched Istas, the old woman, her hands gnarled, but her movements sure as she ground corn, scraped hides, and mended clothing with an awl and sinew. One morning, as Istas worked to grind mesquite beans into flour, Esther rose, took a spare grinding stone, and began to help, mimicking the old woman's rhythmic motions. Istas stopped for a moment, her dark eyes studying Esther with an unreadable expression, and then, with a faint, almost imperceptible nod, she returned to her work. It was not acceptance, not yet, but it was a beginning. It was a crack in the wall of her isolation. Work became her language. She helped gather firewood, carry water from the canyon stream, and tend the small plots of corn and squash the women cultivated. The other women watched her, their expressions ranging from continued suspicion to a grudging respect for her willingness to contribute. They spoke around her, their voices no longer sounding harsh, but simply unfamiliar. She began to pick out words, to associate sounds with actions, her mind instinctively seeking patterns, seeking understanding. Her guard remained a constant, silent presence at the edge of her new, circumscribed life. But the nature of his watch began to change. He was no longer just a jailer, he was a protector. When a group of boys grew too bold, taunting her and throwing small stones, he rose without a word, his imposing stillness enough to scatter them like quail. When a man, his face flushed with the effects of tiswin, a fermented drink, approached her with a leering gaze, her guard materialized between them, a low word from him sending the man stumbling away. One evening, as he brought her the customary bowl of stew, he did not retreat immediately. He lingered, watching her as she ate. "Your name," he said, the English word startling her, rough and accented but clear. She looked up, surprised. It was the first time he had spoken to her since her capture. "Esther," she replied, her own voice feeling foreign in her throat. He considered the name for a moment. "Es-ter," he repeated, tasting the sound of it. He pointed to his own chest. "Ahanu. Ahanu." The name meant "he laughs" in his language. It seemed a profound irony for a man so perpetually solemn. But knowing his name changed something fundamental. He was no longer a faceless symbol of her terror. He was a person, Ahanu. Their conversations started in fragments. He would point to an object, water, fire, hoarsened, give her the Apache word. She, in turn, would give him the English one. It became a quiet ritual, a fragile bridge of language being built across the chasm that separated them. She learned that Ande meant the people, which is what they called themselves. She learned that the world she had seen as a barren wasteland was, to them, a giving mother, full of life and sustenance if you knew how to see it. He began to tell her about himself, not in long speeches, but in small pieces offered up like rare gifts. He told her of his first hunt, of the brother he had lost to the sickness the white soldiers brought, of his duty to his people. His stoicism, she realized, was not a lack of feeling, but a shield for a heart that had known its own deep sorrows. He carried his grief differently than her father did. Garrett's grief was a bitter poison that had turned inward, hardening him against the world. Ahanu's grief was a quiet weight he carried with dignity, a source not of bitterness to her surprise, but of resolve. Esther found herself reciprocating, the words of her own story spilling out into the quiet of the canyon evenings. She spoke of her mother's gentleness, of the music and light that had died with her. She spoke of her father's crushing silence, of the profound loneliness that had been her constant companion. In the firelight, with Ahanu listening patiently, his dark eyes fixed on her, she felt seen in a way she had not felt in years. He did not judge her or her father. He simply listened, his presence a quiet affirmation of her pain. One day, Esther was struck by a coughing sickness that left her weak and feverish. Esther, remembering the remedies her own mother had used, brewed a tea from willow bark she found by the stream and sat with the old woman, bathing her forehead with cool water. She tended to her for 3 days, barely sleeping. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Esther looked at her, her eyes clear for the first time in days, and reached out a frail, wrinkled hand to touch Esther's arm. No words were spoken, but in that simple gesture, Esther felt a profound shift. She was no longer the outsider, the captive. She was one of them. Her bond with Ahanu deepened into something she dared not name. The space between them shrank. They would sit together by the fire after the evening meal, the silence between them now comfortable, companionable. He taught her how to read the stars, not as distant points of light, but as a map, a calendar, a book of stories. She showed him the letters of her alphabet, writing them in the dirt with a stick. One evening, watching the children play a game, a genuine laugh escaped Ahanu, a rich, warm sound that startled Esther and made her heart ache with a strange, sweet pang. He truly was Ahanu. The day he brought her a gift, her world tilted on its axis again, but this time it was not with fear. It was a dress, pieced together from soft, smoked deerskin, beautifully decorated with delicate quillwork by Esther's own hand. It was 100 times finer than the tattered calico she had worn for months. When she put it on, it felt like she was shedding an old skin, shedding the ghost of the girl she used to be. That night he walked with her to the edge of the camp, where the stream tumbled over smooth stones, its music filling the air. The moon was a silver sliver in the dark velvet of the sky. "You are not a captive, Esther," he said, his voice low and serious. "You have not been for a long time. You are free to go." The words hung in the air between them. Go where? Back to the crushing silence and the ghost-filled house. Back to a father who saw her only as a reminder of his own failure. The life she had known felt a lifetime away, a faded photograph of a stranger. She looked at him, at his strong, quiet face illuminated by the moonlight. She saw the man who had protected her, taught her, and listened to her. The man who made her feel a sense of belonging she had never known. "This is my home now," she said, the truth of it settling deep in her soul. "My place is here, with you." He reached out then, his touch tentative, and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. His fingers were warm against her skin. In his eyes, she saw an emotion so profound, so vulnerable, it took her breath away. It was a love as quiet and deep as the canyon itself. And in that moment, Esther Prescott knew she was finally truly free. She leaned into his touch, choosing this life, this man, this unexpected and beautiful home. More than a year passed. A year of 4 seasons lived in the canyon, a cycle of life and hardship, of quiet joys and shared sorrows. Esther became Ahanu Ikie, Ahanu's wife. She was no longer the white captive, but a woman of the on-day, respected for her skill with healing herbs and her quiet strength. Her life was woven into the fabric of the community. She felt Ahanu's love not in grand declarations, but in the steady warmth of his presence beside her at night, in the choicest piece of game he saved for her, in the way his eyes would find hers across a crowded fire, a silent conversation passing between them. She had found a wholeness she never knew was possible. But the world outside the canyon had not forgotten her. The peace was shattered, one crisp autumn morning, by the arrival of a scout, his horse lathered, his face grim. He brought news. A column of blue-coated soldiers, cavalry, was moving through the foothills, and they were not alone. They were being led by a white man, a tracker who rode with a singular, obsessive focus, a man with a graying beard and a familiar bitter set to his jaw. Her father, a cold dread, a ghost of her old fear, coiled in Esther's stomach. Garrett had not given up. He had spent more than a year nursing his wound and his hatred, scouring the territory, fueled by a righteous fury to reclaim what was his. To him, she was not a person who had made a choice. She was a stolen object to be recovered, a stain on his honor to be erased. The canyon, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. The warriors prepared for a fight, their faces painted, their movements swift and purposeful. The women gathered the children, their expressions grim, preparing to flee to the high caves if the fighting came to the camp. The air, once filled with the peaceful sounds of life, was now electric with the hum of impending violence. Ahanu came to her, his face taut with a terrible resolve. He pressed a small bundle into her hands-dried meat, a water skin. "You must go," he said, his voice urgent. "Take the high trail out of the canyon. They will not look for you there. Run, Esther, run, and do not look back." He was prepared to fight, to die, to protect her and his people. He was sending her away to save her life. She looked at him, at the man she loved, who was willing to sacrifice himself for her. She saw the faces of Istas, of the children she had taught, of the women she had worked alongside. These were her people. This was her home. To run would be to betray not only them, but the woman she had become. The frightened girl who had been dragged from her father's well was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew her own mind and her own heart. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She dropped the bundle. "I will not run. My place is here." A look of anguish crossed his face. "Esther, they will kill you, or they will take you. It will be the same." "They will not take me," she replied, a strange calm settling over her. She knew what she had to do. It was a choice more terrifying than any she had ever faced, but it was hers to make. She walked away from him, out from the relative cover of the wickiups, into the open space at the mouth of the canyon. She could hear the jingle of harnesses and the muffled thud of hooves on the hard earth before she saw them. The cavalrymen emerged from the pass, a line of blue and brass, sunlight glinting off their carbines. At their head was a stern-faced officer, and beside him, his face a granite mask of grief and vengeance, rode her father. Garrett saw her. His face broke, a crack in the stone. "Esther," he cried out, his voice raw, a sound torn from the deepest part of him. "Esther, thank God, we've come for you." A murmur ran through the line of soldiers. They stared at her, this figure in a deerskin dress, her hair braided in the Apache style. She did not look like the terrified, brutalized captive they had been led to expect. The officer raised a hand, halting the column. "Miss Prescott," he called, his voice officious and loud. "You are safe now. Come to us. We will take you home." Behind her, Esther could feel the presence of Ahanu and the other warriors, poised and ready, arrows nocked to bowstrings. In front of her was the world she had been born into, a world of rigid order and hollow promises of safety. She stood on the precipice between two lives, two loves, two irreconcilable truths. For a moment, her heart tore in two. She saw the pain in her father's eyes, the years of shared history, the bond of blood. But then she felt the unwavering strength of Ahanu at her back, and she knew where she belonged. She took a deep breath, the crisp canyon air filling her lungs. She looked directly at her father, her gaze steady. "I am not a captive," she called out, her voice clear and strong, echoing off the canyon walls. It carried no trace of fear, only an unshakable conviction. "My name is Esther, and I am home." A stunned silence fell over the clearing. Her father's face went slack with disbelief, his mind unable to process her words. "What devilry is this?" the cavalry officer sputtered, his face flushing with anger. "Girl, have you lost your senses? They've bewitched you." Esther ignored him. She turned slightly, her eyes finding Ahanu where he stood at the edge of the rocks. She raised her voice so all could hear, a public declaration that would seal her fate. "This is my husband," she announced, her gaze locked with Ahanu's. "His name is Ahanu, and these are my people." She walked back to him then, turning her back on the soldiers, on her father, on her entire past. She stopped beside Ahanu, and he took her hand, his grip firm and steady. Together, they stood and faced the soldiers, a united front. Her choice, her public defiance, had transformed the situation. This was no longer a simple rescue mission. To attack now would be to slaughter a woman who claimed, in perfect English, that she was exactly where she wanted to be. The officer was trapped by his own rules of engagement, his righteous cause crumbling before his eyes. The standoff was absolute, the tension a wire stretched to its breaking point. The standoff held for what felt like an eternity. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the silent, armed men. The cavalry officer conferred with his sergeants, their faces a mixture of confusion and frustration. Garrett Prescott sat on his horse, as if turned to stone, his gaze fixed on his daughter, his expression one of utter desolation. He saw not a woman making a choice, but a ghost, a beloved child lost to a world he could not comprehend, a betrayal so deep it shattered the very foundations of his being. Finally, with a curse and a sharp command, the officer gave the order to withdraw. He could not start a war for a woman who refused to be saved. The blue-coated column turned, their movements stiff with anger and thwarted purpose, and began the slow retreat back through the pass. Her father was the last to leave. He lingered for a moment, his eyes pleading with her across the distance, a silent, desperate appeal for her to recant, to come back. But Esther could only meet his gaze with a profound sadness of her own. She loved him, but she could not return to his world of silence and sorrow. She had found her voice here, in the heart of the canyon. With a final, broken look, Garrett turned his horse and followed the soldiers, a man hollowed out by a grief he would never understand. Esther watched him go until he was just a speck in the distance, a profound ache in her chest. The choice for her new life had come at the cost of finally and irrevocably severing the old. A tear tracked a path through the dust on her cheek, a quiet farewell to the girl she had been and the father she had lost. Ahanu squeezed her hand, his touch grounding her. The warriors behind them lowered their weapons, the tension slowly bleeding out of the air. The danger had passed. The people of the rancheria began to emerge from their hiding places, their faces full of awe and a newfound fierce pride for the white woman who had chosen them, who had stood for them. That evening, as the sky bruised into twilight and the first stars pricked the darkness, Esther and Ahanu sat together at the edge of the canyon, looking out over the vast, quiet land. The immediate crisis was over, but the future remained an uncertain country. The world of men like her father and the cavalry officer would not forget. Their peace was fragile, their sanctuary perhaps temporary. But as she leaned her head against Ahanu's shoulder, she felt not fear but a sense of earned peace. Her journey had been one of unimaginable loss and unexpected discovery. She had been stripped of everything she knew, only to find everything she needed. She had discovered that resilience was not about returning to what you were, but about embracing what you could become. Home was not a place of logs and mud, but a space carved out in another's heart. In the arms of the Apache man who loved her, surrounded by the quiet strength of her chosen people, Esther Prescott, now Ahanu Ikie, was finally, truly home.